I want to bring in Bryn Gingras right now. She's also in New York. She just emerged from inside the courtroom. You were there. You were watching it all unfold, Bryn. Give us your thoughts. How did it go?
Yeah, I mean, most interestingly, Wolf, you're watching David Pecker, who was a longtime friend, a confidant of Donald Trump, testifying to the sort of inner workings of how these catch and kill deals were made, how they were paid, how they were reimbursed, how the reimbursement came back or didn't come back. And Donald Trump really wasn't reacting. Quite honestly, he was sitting there at times, sometimes conferring with his attorney, but he was mostly just sitting back in his chair like this with his eyes shut, sort of taking in word by word how Pecker was testifying and what he was testifying to. And it really kind of spoke to some of the testimony we did hear from David Pecker toward the end, that prior to the campaign, when those two, Donald Trump and David Pecker, would talk about those stories that were out about him regarding the doorman, regarding Karen McDougal, Trump said he was embarrassed and that he was worried about what his family would think. But after the campaign, after the election, he was more worried about those coming out because of how it would look for him, outside of his family. So it really speaks to sort of how Donald Trump was sort of, taking in all of this information. The one time that he actually did give a smirk inside the courtroom was when they discussed that meeting inside Trump Tower after President Trump was President-elect Trump. And David Pecker walked into the room and he was surrounded by a number of these people who were advising the now president-elect. And Donald Trump made the comment that this is David Pecker. He's the publisher of the National Enquirer, and he knows more stories about me than anyone else in this room. And Pecker sort of said nobody really laughed at that, but that did get a laugh from Donald Trump. But quite honestly, he has been just really taking in word for word how Pecker is testifying, who really is just kind of pulling back the curtain on every single detail, sometimes having to be reminded about some of the details about how these catch and kills worked. And we didn't quite yet get to the Stormy Daniels. It was touched upon, but we haven't yet gotten to the depth of the Stormy Daniels story, which of course is at the core of this case.
Certainly is. Bryn, thank you very, very much. We'll get back to you soon. We've got an excellent panel here of our legal and our political analysts. And Elliot Williams, let me start with you. What stood out to you the most so far from today's testimony by David Pecker?
I think the biggest point right now, Wolf, from today is the direct link to the Trump campaign, which I don't think has been said explicitly. Now, just to recap, it's important to note that in order to make this a felony, prosecutors have to establish not just catch and kill payments, but also the falsification of business records to hide things from American voters in the context of a campaign. And Pecker says at one point, once the former president started campaigning, it was basically what the impact would be to the campaign and the election. Now, I don't want to leave the impression that that's some kind of smoking gun and the president gets convicted on account of that. What I'm saying is that is a direct nexus to talking about the campaign, where suppressing these embarrassing stories wasn't just about the president and his wife, but actually the president's campaign. It'll be useful for prosecutors, but again, it all comes down to what the jury does with it.
Elie Honig is with us. You've been listening and watching all of this unfold. How do you expect the defense to cross-examine David Pecker?
Well, that could happen starting this afternoon, by the way. It sounds like the way things are going in court, we could see the start of the cross-examination this afternoon. And let me just say, the way that you will feel about a witness as a prosecutor, as a defense lawyer, as a juror after the end of direct examination is often very different from how you will feel at the end of cross-examination. Here's what I think we could see in the cross-examination. First of all, they will say to David Pecker, this catch and kill stuff you were doing at the Enquirer, sleazy, right? You knew it was sleazy, but you never believed this was criminal. And in fact, it's not criminal. Start with that. I think that they're going to go to the limitations of his knowledge. They don't necessarily need to paint David Pecker as a liar, but they could say, essentially to Elliot's point, the crime here is falsification of the Stormy Daniels business records. You don't know anything about the logging and accounting of the Stormy Daniels business records. And then finally, they may sort of go after David Pecker on the fact that he's been given a free pass here. He's been given a non-prosecution agreement. You're given a walk. Donald Trump's on trial. Therefore, you have an incentive to try to help them, the prosecutors.
No, also, they could go after him in a way because he dealt so largely with Michael Cohen. Yeah. And they could try and take Trump out of it and say, look, you and Michael Cohen were very close. You did all the dealings with Michael Cohen. You were even asked to help him get his Christmas bonus or whatever it was. And Trump wasn't as directly involved in this as Michael Cohen has said, and then try and put Trump off to the side in all of this as not being as as involved in a so-called conspiracy as he may well have been.
You know, one more thing. Even if it's not specifically legal or a specific legal point, something prosecutors can do is simply expose what David Pecker does for a living to the jury, which ordinary people, these citizens, do not have a concept of a magazine publisher who pays off porn stars to protect people's reputations. It's the kind of fact that at least plants the seed about someone's credibility in the eyes of the jury. And then when you add to that the non-prosecution agreement that Ellie had spoken to a moment ago, what a defense attorney is trying to do is simply give jurors a reason not to trust or at least like this
I
person.
assume everybody on that jury knows the National Enquirer.
They do, certainly they do, but once details about their business practices and what they actually do is exposed to a jury, it's a perfectly permissible thing for a defense attorney to say, wait a second, who are you and what do you do and what's your job? And it all comes down to how much jurors like, believe, and trust the person who's testifying to them.
Guys, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't what the prosecution is doing overall with Pecker, understanding they have a huge problem with Michael Cohen, trying to bring him in as sort of a substitute to build up this narrative of the scheme, not necessarily to your point of saying Pecker knows the illegal behavior that took place here and observed it and can speak to it, as much as it is try to get as much in from him about the overall scheme, because Cohen is going to be a problematic.
Exactly, and this is a dynamic in every trial. Defense lawyers like to say, look at this little piece of testimony. That's not a crime standing alone. But what prosecutors say is you have to look at all of it, sort of blended together. And I think what they're doing with David Pecker is setting a foundation for the more important witness, Michael Cohen.
And they think that what Pecker is saying will back up what we're going to hear from Cohen.
Yeah, it's not going to be 100% aligned. It never is when two people are telling a story about something that happened 8 years ago. But clearly they're confident enough that it will reinforce Michael Cohen.
And I think what the defense can also do is keep reminding people that the president also had an incentive to keep this information away from his wife and children. Now, it's still a crime if in fact the president had a motive to interfere with the election in some way on account of the behavior. But merely mixing up for the jury the fact that the president had different reasons for wanting these stories not to come out is a great way to just plant that doubt.
But Pecker was asked directly about whether the family was ever raised as a concern, and his answer was no, that this was all about the campaign and that this wasn't personal.
What he does say is that it's shifted at a certain point, but earlier on he does say he was always, if a negative story was coming out, he was always concerned about Melania. He was concerned about Ivanka. He was concerned about what the family might hear or say about it. And I just think the various purposes can twist the jury's minds up.
And his own interpretation as to why, on the Karen McDougal case, that he was thinking about participating in the catch, kill, and stuff was because he thought it could be terribly embarrassing to Donald Trump and his family.
And here, that's the exact quote, David. I was just going to read it. The quote was, quote, "We didn't want the story to embarrass Mr. Trump or embarrass or hurt the campaign." And as Elliot was saying, I think defense lawyers are going to say, oh, when you say embarrass Mr. Trump as distinct from the campaign, that's the family part of it. But again, the law, you don't have to show it was 100% one or the other. Prosecutors just have to show that a substantial part of the motivation here was campaign related.